Hello, my name is Tammy Edwards, and I'm so excited to be with you today to read a story about Ruby Bridges. It's a true story about a young girl and what she went through to get an education in New Orleans. And so the book is called Ruby Bridges, and it is written by Robert Cohen. Ruby Bridges was born in a small town near Tylertown, Mississippi. We were very poor, Ruby said. My daddy worked picking crops. We just barely got by. There were many times when we didn't have much to eat. The people who owned the land were bringing in machines to pick the crops, so my daddy lost his job. And that's when we had to move. I remember us leaving. I was 4 years old, I think. And this is a picture of Ruby moving. In 1957, the family moved to New Orleans. Ruby's father became a janitor. Her mother took care of children during the day. After they were tucked in bed, Ruby's mother went to work scrubbing floors in a bank. Every Sunday, the family went to church. We wanted our children near God's Spirit, Ruby's mother said. We wanted them to start feeling close to Him from the very start. And this is a picture of Ruby and her mother and her brothers and sisters. At that time, Black children and white children went to separate schools in New Orleans. The Black children were not able to receive the same education as the white children. It wasn't fair, and it was against the nation's laws. In 1960, a judge ordered 4 Black girls to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of the girls were sent to Medina 19. 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to the 1st grade in the William France Elementary School. And this is a picture of the families in court. They had to go to court in order to attend those schools. Ruby's parents were proud that their daughter had been chosen to take part in an important event in American history. They went to church. We sat there and prayed to God, Ruby's mother said, that we'd all be strong and we'd have courage and we'd get through any trouble. And Ruby would be a good girl, and she'd hold her head up high and be a credit to her own people and a credit to all the American people. We prayed long and we prayed hard. And you can see Ruby and her family there in church. On Ruby's first day, a large crowd of angry white people gathered outside the France Elementary School. The people carried signs that said that they didn't want Black children in a white school. People called Ruby names. Some wanted to hurt her. The city and state police did not help Ruby. The President of the United States ordered federal marshals to walk with Ruby into the school building. The marshals had to carry guns to protect Ruby. And you could see Ruby is being walked into school by those federal marshals. Every day for weeks that turned into months, Ruby experienced that kind of school day. She walked to the France Elementary School surrounded by marshals, wearing a clean dress and a bow in her hair and carrying her lunch pail. Ruby walked slowly for the first few blocks. As Ruby approached the school, she saw a crowd of people marching up and down the street. Men and women and children shouted at her. They pushed toward her. The marshals kept them from Ruby by threatening to arrest them. Ruby would hurry through the crowd and not say a word. And this is, again, a photo of Ruby entering the school. The white people in the neighborhood would not send their children to school. When Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone except for her teacher, Mrs. Henry. There were no other children to keep Ruby company, to play with or to learn with, to eat lunch with. But every day, Ruby went into the classroom with a big smile on her face, ready to get down to the business of learning. She was polite and she worked very well at her desk, Mrs. Henry said. She enjoyed her time there. She didn't seem nervous or anxious or irritable or scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child I've ever taught. So Ruby began learning how to read and write in an empty classroom in an empty building. And you can see Ruby there all alone in her classroom. Sometimes I look at her and wonder, how did she do it, said Mrs. Henry. How she went by those mobs and sat there all by herself, yet she seemed so relaxed and comfortable. Mrs. Henry would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really nervous and afraid, even though she seemed calm and confident. Ruby kept saying she was fine. The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep on being so relaxed and hopeful, or if she gradually began to wear down, or even decide she no longer wanted to go to school. Then one morning, something happened. Mrs. Henry stood by a window in her classroom, as she usually did, watching Ruby walk toward the school. Suddenly, Ruby stopped right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people. She stood there facing all those men and women. She seemed to be talking to them. And see, this is Mrs. Henry looking out the window at Ruby. Mrs. Henry saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what would Ruby be saying to the crowd. The crowd seemed ready to hurt her. The marshals were frightened. They tried to persuade Ruby to move along. They tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby wouldn't budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into the school. When she went into the classroom, Mrs. Henry asked her what happened. Miss Henry told Ruby that she'd been watching and that she was surprised when Ruby stopped and talked with the people in the mob. Ruby became irritated. "I didn't stop and talk to them," she said. "Ruby, I saw you talking," Mrs. Henry said. "I saw your lips moving." "I wasn't talking," said Ruby. "I was praying. I was praying for them." Every morning, Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from the school to say a prayer for the people who hated her. This morning, she forgot until she was already in the middle of the angry crowd. When school was over for the day, Ruby hurried through the mob as usual. She walked a few blocks and the crowd was behind her. Ruby said the prayer she repeated twice a day before and after school. "Please, God, try to forgive those people, because even they say those bad words, they don't know what they're saying. So you could forgive them, just like you did those folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you." And this is a picture of Ruby praying after school. Later that year, 2 white boys joined Ruby at the Friends Elementary School. Their parents were tired of seeing the boys get into mischief around the house when they could have been at school learning. The mob became very angry when the first white students went back to school, but those boys were soon joined by other children. "We've been sitting back and letting our children get cheated out of an education because some people have tried to take the law into their own hands," one parent said. "It's time for us to fight for the side of the law and for the children's right to go to school and get a good education." They all did get a great education, Ruby and the growing number of boys and girls who went to school with her. By the time Ruby was in 2nd grade, the mobs had given up their struggle to scare Ruby and defeat the federal judge's order that New Orleans schools be desegregated so that children of all races might be in the same classroom. Year after year, Ruby went to the Friends Elementary School. She graduated from it, then went on to graduate from high school. Ruby Bridges is now married to a building contractor and has 4 sons. Now a successful businesswoman, she created the Ruby Bridges Educational Foundation. With its focus on education, community, and the future of our nation's children, the foundation is especially dedicated to revitalizing the William Frantz School, which is located in the heart of the 9th Ward in New Orleans. Ruby is once again stepping to the forefront and embracing an opportunity to make history by contributing to the challenge that our nation is facing in the recovery efforts after Hurricane Katrina. There's also a special exhibit about Ruby in the Children's Museum of Indianapolis, Indiana, called The Power of Children Making a Difference, because Ruby Bridges made a difference. Thank you.